like I kind of have what I would call like almost like the blockbuster theory. What section do you put it in a home video store?
Star Wars is science fiction, fight me. There's loads of people that will go in and say, well, no, it's actually, science fantasy or just strict fantasy.
These tags become useful after some kind of art has been brought into the world.
There's sort of a gatekeepy vibe. It's like, well, if it was real science fiction, I'd be bored while I was reading it.
Like there's a certain group that likes hard science fiction.
Yeah, I think the thing that I keep coming back to is with all categories, they're useful until they're not useful.
That's one way to understand science fiction, is that thematic side. I tend to look at it more from the aesthetic side. I think that both tie back into that idea of what am I going to call this when I'm trying to sell it to somebody?
Genre can say a lot about the work that you're creating. It can give people a sense of where something is going to go, what sort of story beats and tropes they might anticipate getting. And we want to dive a little bit into that from a different perspective. If y'all heard our last interview with Seth, we discussed it more from a perspective of kind of an author kind of creating work and kind of working through their use of genre. This time, I want to talk about it more at a sort of broader, sort of higher critical sort of perspective with Dave. We've been arguing about this for a little while on the basis of a series of comments we actually got on a video I put, Make Science Fiction Weird Again, where a commenter had said, well, this is really more science fantasy, what you're describing. And that launched us into a long discussion where we started breaking down some of the, like, how does genre work? How does it fit here or there? What makes sense? My name is James, and you're joining us today on the Worldcraft Club podcast, a show for writers, dungeon masters, and other creatives who want to create rich, immersive settings for their audience to get lost in time and time again. I've got Dave here with me, and Seth is occupying the producer chair today. So, Dave, why don't you just how do we want to kick this off? Do we want to frame the argument that we've been having, or
Star Wars is science fiction, fight me?
That's a good place for us to start. All right, so essentially what it came to was I made this video, and it was about Dune, and it was about how Dune sort of brings in these very sort of trippy and strange science fiction elements. And science fiction lately has been very much like rocket thrusters. There's the emphasis on the science part of the science fiction, and it's been Iron Man, they've sought to explain why. And
in the first movie.
Yeah, well, right. even in Thor though, they kind of had this idea of other dimensions, and they kind of were they wanted to sort of science-ify it. And I was like, no, make it weird, more Thor Ragnarok, less other Thor movies.
Dark World.
Yeah, well, everybody wants less Dark World.
No, Dark World is better than its reputation.
Oh, you think? Yeah.
I would give it this is a total tangent here, but I actually rewatching Dark World more recently.
You don't hate it.
I was like, this is a solid movie.
Yeah.
It's not one of the greatest movies in the MCU, but
it holds up.
It's a good movie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
I like Christopher Eccleston.
Yeah.
It was unfortunate that his character was kind of flat, but
that can be a writing problem. Yeah.
But he did a good job. He was menacing.
So anyway, genre, right? And figuring that out, it's it is actually like really tricky. And that whole thing of Star Wars is science fiction, fight me. There's loads of people that will go in and say, well, no, it's actually science fantasy or just strict fantasy. I mean, you've got a chosen one, you've got space wizards with laser swords. They don't really explain the technology.
Space wizards with laser swords.
And this really breaks down the difference in our views, right? In some ways. And to be fair, this is a narcissism of small differences sort of thing. I think we're largely in agreement with a lot of this stuff for the most part. But essentially, what I would argue science fiction is, right, looking at genres, is science fiction usually has it has humans as they are now advancing along a certain path technologically that creates the world and the core tensions and conflicts that exist in that world. So an example of science fiction was Arrival, right? Where the aliens arrive. It's not just a clever name. And they talk with the different characters. And it's kind of talking about the impact that language has, and this idea that, spoilers, it's been out for a million years though, but spoilers is the language allows you to sort of manipulate time functionally or understand time differently. And that's sort of science fiction-y because it's well, what if this happened or that happened. Whereas Star Wars is like, what if the laser goes pew pew, and like that's kind of it. You know what I mean? It's like it's not posing those questions. There's no scientific theme.
Is a special incantation, like a special combination of syllables that allows you to control time, that's not fantasy?
Well,
like they just learn magic from like otherworldly beings.
Aliens teach humans magic. I like that. Badly defining movies, right? Arrival. Alien teaches magic to humans.
That honestly, but that sounds. I've not seen the movie myself.
Oh, you haven't? It's really, really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the thing. Like,
yeah. That's a really fair point. That's a very fair point.
To an extent, like, I'm less interested in that particular brand of science fiction.
Yeah.
There's a certain
speculative.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of science fiction that I think functions best as a short story. And like I've read some Asimov. I have enjoyed his short stories. I have endured a couple of his novels.
Yeah.
Because it's like once you've like kind of broken the elevator pitch down into like and you've explored the technology, explored the concept and the format of a short story, you're kind of done.
Yeah.
Because I don't find, and maybe I've just read the wrong novels. I've not read a large body of his work, but like I don't find his characters interesting or compelling the way that I find Han Solo and Luke Skywalker interesting and compelling.
Yeah.
And it may be that they're just too realistic. They're too much like real people, which means like, or almost like they're too much like what people assume other people are like. Like they're kind of just boring. And that has a big impact on what I want to read. So if you're so into the technology and the large scale implications of it that you get too far away from that intimate like character interaction.
Yeah.
Like you might be falling under science fiction, but like not the subgenres of science fiction that I like.
Yeah.
And like this discussion is as old as the term science fiction, right? Because like it's a term that doesn't start to get like really everyday normal usage until about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not that old. Now you'll find instances of it before that from like the 1800s, and it's being used to describe the work of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells in particular.
Yeah.
Sometimes Poe gets roped in there, but I've never seen Poe write about technology. Like maybe he did to some extent.
It can also be like technology. But the thing that's interesting is when we talk about technology in science fiction, we often limit it to physical, like material technology and like the physical sciences and things like that. And I'm not necessarily commenting on Poe here. I think that's interesting, but like oftentimes it's societal technologies that have actually advanced us much further than a physical tech. You know,
right.
Sometimes they go along together, but like determining, for example, a societal technology would be representative government. Is like that was a game changer. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And that's societal tech in a way. So I don't know, maybe.
But
maybe
is that really science fiction? Like, is there such a thing as social science fiction? Like, that's kind of. Yeah. But I mean, that's the sort of the point. It's like these edges are very blurry. So you're in good company with your argument.
Oh yeah.
And it goes back to like the early days of like the pulp magazines that we talk about sometimes.
Yeah. Like
Hugo,
what if there was a cavern underneath the earth that had a bunch of dinosaurs? Like, you know what I mean?
Well,
like,
but the thing is, like we think about that in terms of pulp, and it was pulp. Yeah. Like John Carter, A Princess of Mars was first published serially in magazines as pulp stories. But like there were other magazines that were more deliberately aimed towards the kind of storytelling you're talking about, starting in like the 20s. So Hugo Gernsback actually wanted to make, and that's who the Hugo Awards are named after.
Yeah.
He wanted to start a magazine, and he called it initially. It's so like I've been trying to like practice this scientifiction. Like it's scientific and fiction portmanteaued into one word, and it obviously it never caught on for obvious reasons, but like that was originally what he wanted to call it. But you might have actually heard of the magazine that he ended up actually publishing 2 years later.
Popular Mechanics. Sorry, Gary.
Amazing Stories.
Yes. Yeah.
So Amazing Stories was specifically designed, and as was Galaxy and a couple other, pulp magazines that were all short stories, were specifically designed to do these hard science fiction type things, these stories that were really based in reality. In fact, the first issue of Galaxy makes a point on the back of the jacket that this is not a place to read Westerns set in space.
Yeah.
They actually have 2 parallel paragraphs of stories that do not appear in the book.
Yeah.
That are like, you see, here's where we just overlaid some science fiction-y words on a cowboy story, and here's the cowboy story unadulterated. We're not going to give you that. And it's like, but I want to read both of those stories. And the thing of it is, like, even though that in some circles that became what science fiction was, the term does go back to like Verne.
Yeah.
And if you read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, yes, he is talking about, futuristic ideas about submarines, that kind of submarines were being prototyped then, but there was nothing of that sort. So like that is considered by many, if not all, to be one of the foundational science fiction novels.
Yeah.
But that was an adventure story about a sailor caught up, like basically, who gets press ganged by a submarine captain.
Yeah.
And like that doesn't fit into the more hard-nosed version of what we called science fiction later, even though those were some of the first stories, those what at the time were sometimes referred to as scientific romances.
Yeah.
Like those ideas of that, like, and romance and pulp are like practically interchangeable.
Yeah.
One of the cool things is like, so when we say romantic in the literary sense, we're actually hearkening back to when like Latin was the common language.
Yeah.
And it's what popular stories were published in. They were romantic stories.
Yeah.
So like they were the pulp of their day.
Yeah.
And so like those pulpy, adventure driven, maybe melodramatic or even soppy stories, they have always been there, and they are foundational to what became science fiction. Like, right, that term just kind of percolated up naturally as the genre was developing.
Yeah.
So like, I think that's what you see, and it's kind of what Seth was talking about in the last discussion. These tags become useful after some kind of art has been brought into the world.
Yeah.
And I kind of look at it as like, I kind of have what I would call like almost like the blockbuster theory of genre.
Yeah.
It's like, what section do you put it in a home video store?
Yeah.
And for you kids at home who don't remember this time, we used to go when we wanted to see a movie that we didn't own. We had to go to a physical building, and they had physical copies of these movies, and they would all be broken up into sections. Like now we don't have to do that because it's all digitally cataloged on our various streaming services, so it can be cross-tagged with as many genres as you want. But at some point in history, like someone had to actually look at a movie and be like, what sticker am I going to put on the spine of this like box that contains this weird plastic thing that has film in it, and you put it into another machine and then a video shows up. It's all very arcane, strange.
Yeah, I know,
but
right?
like
You had to rewind.
You could only
at the end when you were done.
But you could only put it in one section of the store.
You know, to this day I still rewind all of the DVDs I borrow.
That's very considerate of you. That's great. But like, if you can only put Star Wars in one box, it goes in science fiction.
Yeah.
There's a spaceship on the cover.
Yeah.
Like, yes, it utilizes fantasy tropes to great effect. Like, and
the Chosen
I'll
One,
even
or like the Dark Lord, or yeah.
But like all those archetypes, like they don't have to be from a fantasy setting, because you can see a lot of those archetypes as well in like a Western or something.
It's tropes. You're basically looking at a collection of tropes, and you're kind of like squinting at it, and like, yeah, I don't know. It's the truth is that I don't find myself really in strong disagreement, and I think one thing that's interesting is you talk about like Asimov's books kind of being a slog sometimes, and like I think some science fiction readers view that as like you know you've really done sci-fi, but
Yeah.
you have slogged through this guy's
and I don't say
or
this
something like that, you know. Like,
I don't say this as like a complete pejorative.
Yeah, no, that's right, pejorative.
But it's kind of like a way of gatekeeping.
Yeah, it's a badge of honor.
There is a cost of entry to be a science fiction fan.
To be a real science fiction
You
reader.
have to be willing to read this stuff.
You have to be at least on your second reading of Dune.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's just that's not all that science fiction is.
Yeah.
And so
it's true.
Like George Lucas, who I have a lot of respect for, I think he is a really great creative. I don't think he's been right about a whole lot since the 1980s in terms of where he wanted to take some of his properties.
Yeah.
But like at the same time, I absolutely he gave us the original Star Wars trilogy. I would never take anything away from him.
He gave us the Cronut. It's enough. You don't have to make any more. You don't have to give anything back, George. You gave us Star Wars. Carry on.
But but he actually said, I never set out to make, or Star Wars was never meant to be a science fiction film.
Yeah.
It was a fantasy and a space opera. Okay, look up space opera.
Yeah.
It's a subgenre
of science fiction.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is the kind of thing it's hard. Everybody's opinions on it are going to be different. And even as you talk about I'm kind of fixated on this thing of sort of enduring the greats with this. It's it's like you go back and it's like, it's real science fiction if you really had to suffer to read through. I've even read recent ones like Three Body Problem, which is I think a lot. I would almost create my little subgenre of science fiction, and the corner that I sort of think about is just conceptual science fiction. That's kind of heavy concept-driven stuff. Like Three Body Problem, I felt was like this, though some of it might have been lost in translation on my reading, but I found it quite dry. But the ideas in it were really, really neat. And I was like, this is a phenomenal concept. And, I would walk away from the book thinking about what I just read, and that was the same with Arrival, in a way that I don't fantasy doesn't seem to pose the question, who do we become when the alien wizards deliver magic, temporal magic to us, whereas science fiction sort of then sits with the characters in a way that fantasy doesn't. It you know what I mean, or doesn't appear to, I should say. And that's it's not exclusive.
Right.
I'm not trying to draw hard lines here. It's all blurry. But I guess what I'm trying to capture in some ways is the way science fiction sort of makes me feel and sort of the stuff it evokes. This is definitely something that we talk about a lot in the Worldcraft Club, and really in that way we're sort of talking about sort of the same thing. You know what I mean? I look at it, I see sci-fi, and I'm I kind of there's a certain subgenre of sci-fi that when I read it or watch it or imbibe it in some way, I walk away from it pondering. I read Consider Phlebas, which I want to say Ian Banks, which would actually sort of thread the needle between both of the things we're talking about here, where you kind of have a really good story, but it's told in the backdrop of really interesting high implication science fiction. So it's a bunch of humans live on orbitals that are basically curated by servitor robots who kind of sort of run everything.
Okay.
And so they're called the culture. And it takes place in the backdrop of a war in which another alien race that has a sort of a genetic superiority complex and a deep spiritualism kind of goes, robots shouldn't rule us, and they just go to war with them. And they know they're going to lose the war, because the way the culture is arranged is just so dang efficient. Nobody can even figure out where the culture really lives, because they don't have borders per se, because they live in these giant orbitals. So they just go places. And so nobody can quite it's just so amorphous that they can't quite crush it. But they've also never been to war. But this other race is highly warlike. And so it's all this long-term catching up thing. And they base this all around a crew of misfits who are traveling around in the middle of the war, and there's an agent of the culture on the ship, and there's an agent of the alien race, and they're sort of, there's a bit of a tango going on between them as they figure this out, but they're also sort of caught in the middle of it. And so they tell a human story on the backdrop of really interesting questions about the role of AI and what makes a human, and exactly the sort of questions I like in science fiction, but done in such a way that it's actually really interesting, in a way that I would make the argument, and I know I'm going to be treading on eggshells here because I recognize Asimov's like greatness in the role that he played in sort of science fiction, but I do find his prose pretty dry. And like, I think you're right. It's a lot of hard science fiction that asks those sort of big, deep exploratory questions sort of winds up in the same boat that many nonfiction books do. You could fit this on a pamphlet, but no one can sell pamphlets. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like 15 minutes of useful information. Seth summarized the book for me the other day, and I was like, I don't need to read the book. Like, mostly because Seth's thoughts come out in like complete whole sentences. He writes the back of books when he just speaks. So it's like he just explained like what the book was about, and I was like, I feel no need to read this book. Like, I feel like you've just told me everything I need to know. That's the same with a lot of these science fiction novels. They make better short stories.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that they began the hard science fiction, right? The people who started out going, this is not a Western.
Yes.
Don't mistake us for a Western. They did short stories based on big concepts that they were exploring.
Yes.
And that was the high science fiction.
I think that's the ideal format for hard science fiction.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
The Noldo elves of science fiction.
So you have a very like thematic appreciation of science fiction.
Yeah.
Where when you come to science fiction, you're looking for a certain type of story, a certain type of like big picture social change, social friction based on technology.
Yeah.
When I come to science fiction, I'm looking for robots and spaceships.
And spaceship fighters.
Yeah.
That's rad.
Right. Yeah, I want Top Gun, but with more lasers. But
additional lasers.
Yeah,
please.
And it's not enough lasers yet. Like whatever you're envisioning,
there's a threshold.
There's more lasers
the shark
that need
cavalry charge in Aquaman, where it's people riding sharks shooting lasers from tridents at each other.
Yeah.
Like, I want to see that, but in space. Now it's science fiction. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah.
Space sharks.
Yeah, and I mean, we could do a whole nother thing about comic books and what those universes are.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
there are space sharks in Thor, I think.
Yeah.
They turn up.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Sure.
Anyway,
I mean, I'm sure there are somewhere.
Why not? They should be.
I am confident that we could find space sharks if we perused Marvel's catalog enough. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think that's one way to understand science fiction is that thematic side. Mm-hmm. I tend to look at it more from the aesthetic side, but I think that both are useful. I think that both tie back into that idea of what am I going to call this when I'm trying to sell it to somebody?
Yeah.
What portion, like what part of the like home video store does this VHS belong in?
Yeah. How do I shorthand this?
Yeah.
Yell out a car window at someone.
Yes. And I think like, and there was an interesting essay, and I'm going to bring Lewis into this again because I just have to do that once per episode, apparently.
It's part of your brand. Don't let it trap you. Carry on.
I can switch to Chesterton.
Come veer into Chesterton.
Yeah.
Why not?
But there's this essay that Lewis wrote called On Story. And in it, he gets into talking about a bunch of different properties, basically, or a bunch of different stories that he's enjoyed, why he's enjoyed them, like what makes them particular. And he says, like, this might not be for everybody. This is the way I see things. He, was a professor in these areas, so he had a lot of conversations with people that disagreed with him on it.
Yeah.
But his kind of point was like, you cannot take the elements away from a story and have it remain the same story. You can't take the aesthetic elements out and have it remain the same. Yeah. And he talks specifically about like fear of death, like imminent danger, imminent life-threatening danger, and like the point of the story cannot just be that emotional thrill of like the character's about to die. Just the threat of death doesn't necessarily evoke the same thing as threat of death from a particular thing. And so he gives a bunch of examples. One was an adaptation that he watched of King Solomon's Mines. And he despised the film rendition. and he talks about why, and he talks about the way that like it changes a story to put it on camera. He actually says in that essay, there's death in the camera. Like, it's kind of just an old school guy.
Yeah.
And what they did with that rendition of King Solomon's Mines is the climax of the book. The heroes are buried alive in a tomb with a bunch of like dead kings. Yeah. Like, and the kings are all, and it's not like a living dead thing. They're just dead, but there's all these mummified former rulers like standing in a circle around them, and they're just trapped underground, and they're threatened to die by, exposure of some kind. Like they will suffocate or they will starve, and they're trapped in this just temple of death, and it evokes certain emotions in you to see the heroes subjected to that kind of thing. Yeah. In the film version, there is a earthquake followed by a volcanic eruption.
Yeah.
And it makes for better film. But it also utterly changes the experience of the visitant.
Yeah.
To have the threat of death be, crushing and burning, and we have to run, versus the cold, like,
slow
reality of
Yeah.
And so like, now that's not an issue where he's changed the genre, but I think that you can very easily attach that then to Star Wars.
Yeah.
If you made Han Solo the captain of a sail ship and a smuggler, it would totally change the vibe. It would change the aesthetic to the point where you have changed the story. It's not Star Wars anymore. You can imagine the Death Star as some kind of mountain fortress, and there's a canyon they have to go through, and they're riding on wyverns or something, and they're like wizards are throwing cannonballs instead of the turrets shooting lasers at them. Like you can imagine all these things. You can change it, and you can keep kind of the skeleton, but you can put a totally different paint job on it. Well, you've just entirely changed the story. The vibes there are totally different. The fact that they are not fighter pilots in space anymore, that they're some kind of like wyvern cavalry or something, would utterly change what Star Wars is.
Yeah.
On a level that is important. Star Wars is immutably in a science fiction, I will happily say science fantasy setting.
Yeah.
It is science fiction. It is also fantasy. These things are okay. These are not exclusive categories.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of it is the genres they get muddy. You know what I mean? And I think the thing that I keep coming back to is with all categories, they're useful until they're not useful. And that's the thing is I don't think it does to get too tied up in it. I think a lot of times there's sort of a gatekeepy vibe to is it real science fiction? It's like, well, if it was real science fiction, I'd be bored while I was reading it. And it's
you can say that Star Wars is bad science fiction. Yeah. If that's your argument, okay, we could talk about that.
Oh yeah, no, that's fair. But excluding the category imbues you with a sense of, it's, I get to decide that. What I mean? That's me.
And I understand why a certain group, there's a certain group that likes hard science fiction.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I don't want to take that away from anybody. I just don't think that group owns the term science fiction, especially since it does predate them and was used to describe the scientific romances like Jules Verne.
Yeah.
You don't own that word. And but this really does just become these semantic gatekeepy, that's our word argument. That's it's not, I don't know that it's helping anyone. I don't know that it's particularly useful. Like you're saying, these terms are useful till they're not.
Yeah.
And when it just becomes these internecine fights of no, you're a fantasy fan and that's a space opera. That's not really science fiction. It's well, yeah, but everyone in the culture, you just do man on the street kind of things. What genre is Star Wars? People are going to say science fiction. Well, you might find that 1 in 100 guy that's going to be well, actually.
Well, it's yeah, and it's yeah. Yeah. It comes down to this whole thing. It's like even like it to me it's like the GIF debate, right? Like so there is the basic received wisdom, right? Whatever you heard as a kid, you have that's the word you use. Whether you had people around you saying GIF or GIF, you kind of say one or t'other. And as you go along, you then sort of enter the sort of mid-tier intellect ground where you start to form reasons why you were right and your received wisdom is right, or you challenge it, right? It's like it's one or the other. You sort of deconstruct it and you start going, well, you know, the people that actually created GIF used to say choosy programmers choose GIF, and they meant it to be a soft J, and don't really they get to decide? And then someone else comes in and goes, I don't know, do you say giraffical instead of graphical? It's graphical, you know, interchange format or whatever, and it's like, you don't say that. And then you respond with, well, do you say scuba instead of scuba because it's self-contained underwater breathing apparatus? And it's like,
don't even get me started on laser.
I know, right? Last year, it's not. All right, signal. Like, anyway.
Signal is an acronym?
Well, S is one of the acronyms in laser,
yes.
right?
Okay,
so
sorry.
Anyway,
sorry.
It's like, you know, the point is those debates are like fun and they can be interesting, but they don't really get you anywhere, because at the end of the day, once you've received your full dose of wisdom and you've gone through the phase of just arguing,
and you've been sophomoric,
and you've kind of you've become a senior, you kind of just go, you know what, most people say GIF. And you're just like, and you just sort of accept it. You know what I mean? You accept the received wisdom. And like, I think you sort of get into this thing where you start and you go, oh yeah, Star Wars, that's sci-fi. And then someone goes, well, actually. And they go into like a long discussion about, you know, the origins of sci-fi. And where
the problem is that Han Solo has a personality, so it can't be science fiction.
The problem is when I read it, I find it interesting. And it's you know, it's like, it's all this kind of stuff. And then like, eventually they get to the other end, and then they just point at it and go, that's sci-fi. Like that's when you've reached you've reached maturity. Like it's when you can just kind of easily, when you can hold the debate in an open hand. It's like nerd etiquette, you know, is like where we kind of need to arrive as a culture.
Because creators like don't necessarily approach things as I am going to write X kind of novel.
Yeah.
These are just tags we kind of put on after, and they do serve a purpose, but like it comes down to like there was back in the 60s the Supreme Court was hearing an argument about obscenity laws.
Yeah.
And how do you define obscenity?
Yeah.
And one of the justices says, I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
And like that's how genre works.
Yeah.
Like you can be uncomfortable with that if you like, but like as much as we want to put it all into hard and fast boxes, like what is science fiction? I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
Like I've seen some really interesting articles. One of them was actually like used that connection between that
Supreme
Court quote and science fiction. Like one definition I saw for science fiction, I can't remember who it was accredited to, but was what we're talking about when we use the word. It's like that is unhelpful. But it's also accurate.
There's so much like good wisdom just behind the useful until it's not useful, which is like a useless statement, like until it isn't. And like that's like the kind of tricky thing.
The tautological society of tautology.
Basically, genre is useful until it's not. Don't let yourself get too tied down and too married to the idea of a given genre, certainly when you're reviewing or critiquing work, but also really when you're creating it. Don't let those boundaries tie you down and operate in the way that you want to. Like Seth had said in the prior episode, pick your tropes and work with them, and that's really what you're actually exploring with this. Like, don't get stuck in that sophomoric phase. I think in this as well, we explored a little bit of nerd etiquette, right? When we're in these discussions, it's important to sort of hold them in an open hand and remember that your tight sort of definitive take on things is going to probably have some challenges to it. And a lot of times there's a lot of good received wisdom in the community. I know that's science fiction because I see it sci-fi, and you can make the argument that it's science fantasy as much as you want, but at the end of the day, people are just going to point at it and go, lasers. And like, we're done. That's science, right? So that's where I kind of want to close this out. This has been another episode of the Worldcraft Club. I'm James. For Dave, Seth on the cameras over there, and editor AJ, probably in Valheim. Good night. So continuing some discussions on genre. No, you don't like that? Seth's like shaking his head. Well, why wouldn't I look at you? You're wearing one of those fruit hats that the ladies wear on the front of those cans.
It doesn't really match the kilt.
I know. It's a bizarre look.